with introductions. So I'm the chair of this committee, County Councillor Lisa Dimmock for the Elms ND.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny Manager.
Nicola Perry, Democratic Services.
Paul Jordan, Cabinet Member for... I'm doing three things at the same time. The governance.
Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance.
County Councillor Jamie Trahan, Member for Overmonnow, Member of this committee.
Councillor Joe Watkins, Caldecott Castle Ward, observing.
Councillor Roger Harris, Crossonland Ward, Abergavenny, and Member of this committee.
Councillor Dave Evans, Member of this committee and Member of West End Ward.
Martin Croker, Member for Lansdowne Ward, and here by invitation.
Councillor Alan Davis, Green Lane Ward, Caldecott, here by invitation.
County Councillor Tony Easton, Deuce Ward, Caldecott, Member of this committee.
Thank you all. Do we also have any apologies? I know we've got Councillor Webb and Dovey.
Yes, we've also had apologies from Councillor Guppy, Councillor Clark and Councillor Smith.
Thank you. So we're meeting here today to consider a call-in request in respect of an individual Cabinet member decision taken on the 12th of June regarding the safe staffing structure for local democracy and business support. I will now hand you over to Hazel, who will tell you about the process.
Just like to say a couple of words about the call-in process, particularly for new members, but also for the public. The process that we'll follow today is the Council's call-in process, which is outlined in our Constitution. So the purpose of a call-in is to consider the appropriateness of a decision that has already been taken by an executive member, a decision that has been called in by members and asked to be considered by this select committee, Strong Communities. So just to sort of confirm really what we're able to do and what we're not able to do at this meeting, the committee is not able to make a decision itself, but having followed the Council's call-in procedure can do one of three things. They can firstly either accept the Cabinet member's decision, or they can refer the matter back to the Cabinet member for reconsideration with reasons. And the third option is to refer the matter to Council, bearing in mind that Council has two options. It can either accept the Cabinet member's decision or it can refer it back to the Cabinet member with reasons. Council is not able to make a decision on the call-in, but has those two options. So the call-in procedure allows for members who requested the decision to be called in to speak first, outlining the reasons for calling in the decision. You can do this individually, but it would probably be helpful if one person would like to discuss the reasons and outline those on behalf of the call-in members. The next stage would be for the Cabinet member to then respond. Following that, officers can respond. And then the Chair will ask the Select Committee members to comment if they wish to do so. There'll be an opportunity then for any other elected members to ask their questions prior to the Select Committee considering the way forward. So just to confirm that only members of Strong Communities Select Committee will be able to vote on the course of action proposed. That is okay if you are a member of Democratic Services Committee, provided you are a member of this Select Committee. But just to confirm, only members of this Select Committee can vote on the action going forward. Okay.
Thank you, Hazel. So now I'd like to invite the members who requested the call-in to speak. Who'd like to go first? Okay.
Right, thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to, on behalf of my colleagues here, I'd like to make it clear that this is not a call-in based on we just don't like the reorganisation, because we all recognise that there are occasions when things have got to change, and I've had to do it myself on many occasions. But what we don't recognise here that this has been done as it should have been done, and we also have very great concerns about some of the consequences associated with it. Now, Mr. Gatehouse there gave us a report. I don't know whether you've actually got that, Chair, the document you put out, Matthew, originally. The first item on there was local democracy team has benefited from advances in technology. Now, I can go through all of those points if you like, and but I'm going to put, having spoken to the staff, what the staff are saying, which contradicts a lot of what was in Mr. Gatehouse's report. Okay, so on that first point about the technology, this is the response that we've had as members. This is the wording contained in the restructure report for 2014. No further efficiencies have been realised as a result of modern gov or other electronic systems since then. Areas where we could make further efficiency savings, such as officers uploading their own reports, electronic live forward plans with items submitted by officers directly, I have been told not to implement. Members' expenses are now submitted and approved electronically. Kelly changed the rules on how we process these when she was the head of Democratic Services. We used to verify the claim and check attendance before approval, whereas now we just authorise the claim without checking it. It's a bit of a side point really, but I can see us getting caught out with it and having to go back and check claims, and we need to make sure capacity is available to do that. Live streaming means that production of minutes is easier, as Democratic Services officers are able to refer back to the meeting, recording to produce a record of discussions. This means that minutes of some meetings, such as select committees, can be produced after the event. It is easier for us to produce an accurate minute by utilising the stream to refer back to when we draft them up. But the time is still required to draft the actual minute as a document, and will take the same time, if not more, by not being in the meeting. There will be lots missed if they are not in the meeting itself. If the clerks are not in the room, they will be unaware of particular contentious parts of the meeting where further detail might be needed. We will have a strange situation where the clerk who has produced the minute won't be in the following meeting to note amendments or respond to questions about those minutes. Support for members during the meeting disappears. How can someone make a note of proceedings whilst dealing with members' queries as the meeting progresses? What if the stream fails? A microphone is broke. A member doesn't use the microphone correctly. In selects where the debate is more conversation and informal than others, members can often turn away from the microphone and camera and have their own conversations on the side. Officers are similar in turning to talk to the chair away from the microphone, so may miss information on the stream. If a security officer is passing a note of the meeting to a clerk to prepare a minute, who has responsibility for it? We are at the mercy of Microsoft and Google in terms of Skype and YouTube as to how reliant the streaming is and how their terms and conditions affect its use. We also are at the mercy of SRS, who make decisions without consulting the authority, and the impact it has on individual teams and services. SRS, for example, do not support the technology used in the council chamber, as it is provided by an external supplier and does not meet their requirements. Skype meetings are only retained for 3 months by Microsoft servers before the video is deleted. We can transfer to YouTube, but takes a full day to move one video across platforms. The Welsh Audit Office undertook a governance audit and reported on it in 2016. Points around the reliance of live streaming are addressed in their report here, from points 19 onwards. Also mentioned as another recommendation, recording decisions clearly and consistently to provide a reliable audit trail. Everyone accepts support for selects needs to be increased. My major concern that we have a detached process summarised below, and this is the report that Matthew put out. There is detaching the process of how the decision flows through the council, with Democratic Services dealing with the outset and the end, but scrutiny dealing with items that flow through select. My suggestion was to use Democratic Services officers to assist the scrutiny manager in coordinating the select agenda, thereby sharing knowledge of issues and awareness of actions and issues. Increase support and contingency for those arrangements, with more staff aware rather than relying on an individual. Better cohesion for the Cabinet and Select, knowing outcomes recommendations from Selects when recording Cabinet decisions. The proposal is also cost neutral. The restructure is appointing a person to increase engagement in decision making and partly support the Select process by sitting in meetings and passing a note to Democratic Services to form a minute form. This is without a plan on how we are going to use this person to carry out the engagement, and our own processes are not in place to support them, as highlighted previously. How can they increase engagement in decisions when using the chart above, we only get told some decisions a day or so before the agenda is published? I could go on, but I'm not going to. But I mean, what is clear here is that this process hasn't been thought out clearly, that the staff haven't been consulted as they should have been. I think it's amazing that this was put to a single cabinet member decision when it affects every member of this council. And not only that, but affects the health and well-being of the staff, because there doesn't seem to have been appropriate consideration to given to that. So I'd like to read to you something from ACAS. And we know that historically we have high levels of stress, sickness in this authority. And what it says here is, defining an employer's duty of care. Employers have a duty of care to their employees, which means that they should take all steps which are reasonably possible to ensure their health, safety and well-being. Demonstrating concern for the physical and mental health of your workers shouldn't just be a legal duty, there's a clear business case too. It can be a key factor in building trust and reinforcing your commitment to your employees, and can help improve staff retention, boost productivity, and pave the way for greater employee engagement. Legally, employers must abide by relevant health and safety and employment law, as well as the common law or duty of care. They also have a moral and ethical duty not to cause or fail to prevent physical or psychological injury, and must fulfill their responsibilities with regard to personal injury and negligence claims. So our concern here, and always was, that first of all there was insufficient consultation with the staff. 90% of members I talk to have no idea what this actually means for them in terms of the service they get, so they haven't been consulted. At the Democratic Services Committee, we suggested to the officer that when it went to the single cabinet member decision, that was taken out, that part about the reorganisation of democratic services, and handed on to cabinet. And I was quite surprised to read the report then to find that it had actually been passed by the single officer decision. So that didn't comply with what the Democratic Services Committee had decided or recommended. What I'd also like to remind this council, and I'm very surprised by the way this has been handled, is we have a duty to take care of our employees, to consult with them. What this recommendation does is actually provide members with a lower quality of service, provide the cabinet with a lower quality of service, ignore the concerns of the employees that have to do the work. We had no coherent response from the officer when we asked, well, if one of these people are off on the sick or are away for some other reason, because they have a lot of other employment rights as well, who is going to cover that work? And we were told, oh, people in the business section will do that. So we asked the question, well, are these people sat around all day doing nothing then? Because presumably they've got a workload as well. So that is going to put more pressure on them. There is no coherent response to who is going to do this extra work. And there's no coherent response to, are the members in the cabinet going to receive the same standard of service as they do now? And I would remind people in this room, and I'm sure the officer behind me, that should we fail in our response to take care of these employees' health and well-being, and should we put them under undue pressure, because none of us knows what goes on in the minds of other individuals, we could well reach the stage where, if a tragedy was to occur, we will then be into the realm of corporate manslaughter. Because in my opinion, they have ignored the concerns of their staff, given insufficient weight to it, and if they put their staff under so much pressure because they reduce in numbers without the ability to put any IT in to take that work on, then that is unacceptable. Thank you, Chair. I believe, Chair, just as a last, you had an email of Councillor David Dovey, right, outlining his concerns as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. I will have to note, though, you do have to stick to the reasons that you outlined in the call-in. The additional points haven't been provided in advance for the meeting today. We have noted Councillor Dovey's points raised, so I will now offer the Cabinet Member. Are you happy to come in? And yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Dovey has raised points. I don't know what those points are. I need to know those points.
If a member doesn't attend a meeting, normally we wouldn't read points out, but they are in line with the points that Councillor Davis has just mentioned and some of the grounds for the call-in. So I'll just read through those quickly. The first one concerned that Democratic Services is already undermanned for the current workload, not convinced that the reorganisation would remedy this. Number two, particular concerns about the suggested support for select committees. 3 would be the full-time DSO committee officers. 4, concern about process. The number 5, concern about staffing levels and sickness. These have already been outlined and discussed. Number 6, around the live streaming. Number 7, the feeling that there needed to be a better consultation perhaps and wider scrutiny of the issue. I think that's outlined in the call-in, so there's nothing new there. Number 8, concern the proposal was published before adequate discussion. That ties in with the previous point. And number 9, Democratic Services provide IT support and the support for members in terms of IT. So they really do cover points that you've just already raised, but you know, we've outlined those.
Thank you on that, Chair. So it would be interesting. He's not here. Be interesting to see how he would have voted, but we'll never know, will we?
Thank you, Councillor Harris. Councillor Jordan.
Thank you very much. Right, I see this call-in in four parts. Something like 1, was adequate consultation undertaken with councillors? 2, was it in accordance with the council's constitution for this to be taken as a single member's decision? Did I, as cabinet member, act beyond my powers in taking this decision? Thirdly, is the proposal for shorter minutes legal and consistent with access to information procedures? And fourthly, operational staffing matters are a domain of officers and not politicians. The answer to the 4 parts to include, I'll take them individually now. Number 1, the report has been on the planner for some time, and any members could have contacted me or the author for more information. There were some staffing issues which it's not appropriate to discuss in a public forum that impacted on the timescales for this paper, and I appreciate that in an ideal world we would have shared this with members earlier. The proposals were originally due to be presented to Democratic Services Committee on Monday the 20th of May, but this meeting was postponed at the Chair's request due to the European elections taking place that week. A copy of the report, as with all ICMD and Cabinet reports, are shared with SLT and Cabinet as consultees. In addition to this proposal, it was discussed at the Chairs of Scrutiny meeting on the 10th of June, which I was present at, and following discussions there were no objections. And indeed, on that point, one of the members who called this in, Councillor David Evans, was contacted by the officer, Matthew Gatehouse, on the 7th of May, offering to have a discussion with regard to the paper, and the draft paper was sent to Councillor David Evans on the 8th of May, and nothing further was heard from Councillor Evans. Right, dealing with the second point, this decision was taken in accordance with Part 3, responsibility for functions outlined in the Constitution. In the past, we've seen decisions coming to Cabinet that do not need to come to Cabinet. Most decisions about structures can be taken by officers under delegated powers. My role as Cabinet member is set out in the policy direction. Staffing is an operational matter for officers. Having spoken to the monitoring officer and the proper officer, I remain satisfied that the proposal with regard to minute taking are entirely legal and appropriate. There's no legal definition of a minute under the Local Government Act 1972, and I would draw your attention to the last meeting as an example of the length of time devoted to minutes at meetings. The members were not proposing to change the arrangements of council, only at select committees. I understand that a review will be taking place in 6 months' time. Staffing matters are not an issue for committee. I'm assured from the report that the response of the Head of Policy and Governance that the arrangements will provide an appropriate level of staffing for the delivery of those functions. The support for members consists of 4 members of staff. That's the lead as chairman, secretary, part-time administrative assistant and 2 part-time member secretaries. These have not been weakened by the proposals. In fact, they've been strengthened with the enhanced role for the administrative assistant to the chairman and leader becoming a member of the support officer. Staff had a 2-week statutory consultation as well as a number of informal engagement sessions beforehand. We also consulted trade unions who did not raise any concerns with the proposals. I recognise that these changes may cause some uncertainty for staff, and I commend my colleagues for the concern that they show for the officers. However, we're a small organisation. There are many positions within the authority that have little or no cover. We cannot afford to staff every section to cover every eventuality. To do so would mean diverting resources from important local services. It's worth remembering that this overall represents an uplift in staffing of around half a full-time employee at the time when the authority is trying to secure millions of pounds of savings each year. As a matter of interest, I took it upon myself to look on the internet as to how to write effective minutes of meetings. They should include the name of the participants, agenda items, calendars or due dates, actions or tasks, and the main points. And finally, the decisions made by the participants. Minutes are not a detailed report of your board or committee meeting. Less is more.
Thank you, Councillor Jordan. Can I now ask the officer to come and answer some of the questions?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chair. Just to add to Councillor Jordan's comments. As Councillor Jordan has mentioned, in an ideal world, looking back, it would have been really good to have involved people much earlier in this as the committee. I recognise that. Democratic Services Committee has a really important role to play in terms of, sort of overseeing the democratic arrangements of the council. As I explained when the committee met last time, there are a number of ongoing HR issues that meant although staff have been involved from a much earlier date, and we've been working on these proposals since September of last year, because of a few issues, it wasn't appropriate to put that report on the planner and into the public domain. In normal circumstances, I would have done so. As soon as we were able to do that, the report was placed on the planner. The chair at that time of Democratic Services Committee, Councillor Evans, was alerted to the upcoming report. Councillor Evans asked me, I think, the same day or the following day for a copy of that, and it was sent to him the day after his query containing the details as outlined. I explained at that time that it was on the agenda for the committee on the 20th of May. Unfortunately, because of the European elections, the chair took the decision to postpone that meeting, and that meant it was happening very close to the date of the single member decision. But just to stress, in terms of the process that will follow, there has been staff engagement. I would accept that there are a number of points in there that the staff, in particular around the amount of capacity that they feel servicing a select committee requires, despite not being present in that meeting. So there is a point there where that was the main point raised in staff consultation. So it was shared with all affected staff. I received comments back from 2 members of staff, no comments from the trade union. I agreed to meet, or offered to meet with all members of staff during that period. HR have been involved throughout the process. This has been done in accordance with the authority's recruitment and sort of employment processes. In terms of capacity, as members, this council runs the way it does because this council has never been afraid to take difficult decisions. It's focused on putting resources where they need to be. It's focused on embracing technology and new ways of working. Over the last 4 years, as members, you've seen or overseen savings of 17 to 18 million pounds, which means you're able to continue to deliver important frontline services. It is always difficult when we have to make structural changes. I hate making change that impacts negatively or causes any anxiety for colleagues. Yet the reality is we are in a world where we need to change. The proposals overall result in a 0.5 increase in capacity at a time when a lot of areas of our business are seeing reductions. As I said, you've overseen 17 or 18 million pounds of saving. As an authority, I think we need to take in the region of another 4.7, 4.8 million pounds of spend out of the budget next year based on current forecasts. That will continue. What I've tried to do with this report is to put some capacity into the area where we recognise we need it. Support for scrutiny. Well, taking advantage of some of those savings that we've seen in terms of the streaming to try and free up some capacity there. In an ideal world, we would be able to recruit more resources for scrutiny without losing resource anywhere. The reality is we're not operating in an ideal world. I feel as head of service that the changes brought forward, the decision that the cabinet member has taken is the best balance in terms of that mix. You'll see that as well as some of the feedback we had at the committee last time was around IT support. You'll see there's been a change in role for the member secretaries. You know, if you think how individually you all use the 2 member secretaries you have, has been boosted with the admin assistant for the chairman and leader stepping up into a role as member support, which gives the capacity to provide additional support. We've moved the team over here, you'll see, as you come in today. So they're much more on hand to deal with some of those ICT issues. So yeah, I think those are sort of the key points from myself. I mean, and you know, what I would say, sort of broadly speaking, in terms of capacity, just have it. There are sort of, on average, including select committees, what are we on? Around 14 meetings a month. Under the new arrangements, we will have 2 full-time equivalent democratic services officers or committee officers rather than 2.5, so it was a reduction of 2.5. We retain the post of senior democratic services officer who also attends meetings, even allowing for a significant portion of that time being in terms of management. If I just have a little look at sort of what that means in terms of meetings, it means each member of committee staff covering just over sort of 6 meetings a month, based on sort of 2 full-time DSOs and half of the senior member of staff's time working on committees. So. Yeah, once you even take into account holidays, leave, a typical sort of sickness absence level, and recognising that the committee officers, the DSO, do a huge amount of work beyond meetings, but you're looking at an average of sort of 22 hours a month to sort of service a meeting, the agenda, the associated paper. So that's just to give you some sort of sense of the resource that will be left within the system.
Thank you, Matthew. Can I now invite select committee members to comment? Councillor Eason.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions of clarity. The meeting which was scheduled for 20th of May was postponed or cancelled at the chair's request. What was the reason given to the chair to cancel that meeting? You see, you use the words European elections, but I understand that staff were tied up on European elections, so really it was because there's no staff available for that meeting, not so much the chair decided to cancel it. The second one is operational matters. It comes up quite a number of times, and I've recently, last week, I questioned another matter which has been put to me as an operational matter, which I felt needed being called in. It suggests to me that the words operational matters can be used to bypass the procedure which we believe is scrutiny. The other one which did concern me, I didn't find the video on the Democratic Service Committee till this morning. I was told where it was. I didn't know it was on Skype. I was a bit concerned to find that officers' names were mentioned. I'd like to see them bleeped out personally. You say consultation has been fully considered. It has not gone before the JAG Committee, the Joint Trade Union Action Group. And yes, I read this report, and I thought, well, why haven't councillors been consulted? Because it's our service at the end of the day, irrespective of where you consider the HR functions lie. So they're my first reactions. Perhaps might have some clarity later on, maybe another couple more questions later. Thank you.
Matthew, do you want me to hand over to you, or do you want to take some more questions on top of that?
Chief, if you're happy to, I think it looks like Councillor Evans wants to come in as well, but I'm happy to sort of get a few questions and sort of group them together.
Okay, Councillor Evans.
The reason why the meeting was cancelled on the 20th was because of the elections. But before that, I cancelled it. I went to and asked, on the agenda was he was coming to the Democratic Services to do a verbal outlay of restructure of the Democratic Services. I looked at this and I thought, no, this has got to be an agenda item. So there would be a tailback, you know, if anything happened or went wrong. And then I decided then to cancel the meeting for the simple reason it was the elections. And we had, and Mr. Matt said that would be great because that would give him a bit more time to have consultation with the staff, right? And that's when it was, because it was rearranged for June, and that's when we had the meeting. That's the reason why the meeting was cancelled.
Thank you, Councillor Evans. Does that answer your question, Councillor Eason?
The question's been answered, and I can see the ramifications around it, but I understood that with the elections coming up for the European elections coming up, a number of meetings were cancelled because staff were tied up on European elections. The point I'm trying to make is that the staff are pretty busy, and because they were busy on something else, that meeting and others had to be cancelled, which illustrates again that the staff on democratic services are pretty tightly on tight work schedules. That's the point I'm trying to make, really.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, would you like to answer the rest of Councillor Eason's questions or comment?
Yeah, so just to pick up on some of those, and refers back to Councillor Evans' point as well, I think, in terms of when I sought HR advice on this being discussed at the committee, there are some concerns, and I think I had to say it at several points when the committee met. This was a very difficult discussion to have in a committee forum. Normally, staffing matters, or things of this nature, don't come before committee. They're either taken as delegated officer powers or single-member decisions. The sorts of questions that were raised in that committee, I felt were focused very much on staff well-being, concerns for staff welfare. Those are very difficult conversations to have, to talk about individuals in a public forum, in a live stream meeting, because as mentioned, there are a number of issues that I simply cannot go into in a public meeting. It would not be right to do so. And Councillor Eason has rightly mentioned a point there where I can't recall the precise mentions, but individual members of staff, or certainly job titles, have been made. And that's why, you know, generally these issues are not issues for committee. They are issues for officers to take under delegated powers, or their decisions which are taken as single-member decisions. A number of the issues that have been outlined today are around staff rather than necessarily structures, or that support you need as officers. The role of the Democratic Services Committee is to ensure that the resource is there to run an effective democratic function. The committee, Democratic Services Committee, has been talking over the last 12 months around the sort of actions that need to be taken to improve the democratic function and character of the organisation. The committee has spent an awful lot of time in a number of meetings talking around how we need to put that capacity into going out to working differently within our communities. As head of service, as statutory head of democracy, I'm paid to look at evidence and to make recommendations based on the evidence, how I see those services running, to make the best possible use of resources to provide you with members, to provide Monmouthshire County Council with support arrangements that are as effective as possible within the resources we have available. And actually, Democratic Services Committee is probably in a unique situation. These are the only structure, if you look at sort of, this committee has the responsibility to review those arrangements and ensure that or certainly to review those arrangements and put views to the cabinet member, because ultimately the decision is one for the cabinet member. It's not one for me as head of paid service, and it's not one for this committee. After the meeting, if you recall, I captured the views of the committee. We spent some time at the end of that meeting capturing your views, which I agreed to put to the cabinet member alongside the recommendations for consideration. It's my understanding, and Councillor Jordan may wish to correct me or add more, is that on that basis he has made that decision having regard of all of the information. He's had regard of your views as a committee in terms of what you shared and the wording which I captured and which as a committee you agreed. That has then gone to Councillor Jordan, who's made that decision. Looking at the reasons behind the call-in, he's considered those and outlined those today. But I would just stress, issues of staffing, issues of people will always be difficult and will always be complex, because these are our colleagues. These are the people that work hard day in, day out for you, for me, for the members of Monmouthshire. And it is tough when we have to take decisions that place people in difficult situations, because I feel when that happens. Unfortunately, as head of service, these are sometimes the recommendations which I have to put forward.
Thank you, Matthew. I'd now like to invite Councillor Davis and Councillor Jordan. Microphone, Councillor Davis.
I don't think there's any indication in the document, and nobody has questioned the right to the council or the officer to make that decision. I'm not aware that it's in that document at all, so we've never questioned that. What we are questioning is, and I'm speaking as somebody who've made lots of very similar decisions over the years, more than I care to remember, but when you make a decision like this, the first thing you look at is what is going to be effect on your customers. Are they going to get the same service that they get now, or are they going to get a better service? And you also look at what effect does it have on your staff and what are the implications for your staff. So whilst we recognise that you have the right to make these decisions, we also have the right to raise concerns. And what we felt was that there had been insufficient scrutiny in terms of this is something that affects all members of this council. And most council members were not really aware of what was happening anyway. So you have the right to make the decision, we recognise. You have the right to ignore the concerns of the staff, but then at the end of the day you have to put up with the consequences and prove that what you're saying is that this isn't going to affect members and it's not going to affect the stress levels of the staff. You have to prove that that's right, because that will be shown by experience, won't it? But in my view, perhaps it's time for to have a little bit of a rethink about this for the sake of half a position, because I'll ask Matthew the question I asked him in the other meeting: what happens when one of these people is off on the sick? Who covers the work?
Thank you, Councillor Davies. Councillor Jordan?
No, I think we mustn't get away from the fact that we're improving the service here. We're going to have an additional scrutiny officer supporting members. And week before last, I was in Mid Wales at a conference run by Cardiff University Business School, and it was quite clear that the mantra from them is that good scrutiny leads to good governance. There's an excellent publication, I'm sure you'll find a copy of it here, Handbook to Scrutineers, and that is the bedrock of what we're meant to be doing. Scrutinising decisions of the council, and unless we've got resilience to scrutinise, governance goes out the window.
Thank you, Councillor Jordan.
Council. This
Matt, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, and just to pick up on Councillor Davis's point explicitly, so I think I did mention it in my broader answer. And I think it picks up a little bit of Councillor Issa's point as well. As an organisation, we are not funded at a level that enables us to staff so that we have cover for every eventuality. You know, if you look at the example of an election, yes, you know, it does mean that things have to give. You know, I think we all sort of recognise that John runs an incredible ship with that team, and when it comes to elections, it's often the case of all hands on deck. You know, the number of staff that step into polling stations as polling clerks or presiding officers, the teams that we have staffing tables at Chepstow Leisure Centre. It's one of those occasions because it only happens a few times in every 5-year cycle. You know, we have the European elections, we have the general elections, we have county council elections, and there's a lot of unseen work that John does in terms of community and town council elections that don't necessarily register on everyone's radars. But we don't staff for each of those elections being able to happen without disrupting other business. And similarly, there are teams throughout this building, throughout the council, that actually are not staffed to a level that they can cope perfectly well with staff sickness. That wouldn't be to staff optimally. If every business, if every organisation staffed to a level where you had enough staff not only to run your day-to-day operations, but to continue to run those operations if the members of staff they didn't turn up, very few people would be cost effective. You know, the figures I shared with you earlier work on an assumption of sickness being at a typical level for the local authority. They assume annual leave of up to 30 days a year. They build in 10 days of bank holidays each year. But I go back to the point. We are not of a scale, we do not have the resources to staff every function to be able to cope with every single eventuality. What we have done with the structural changes is to put the business support, you see the title of the report is changes to business support and local democracy, alongside that team and incorporate into the job descriptions of the leadership support team based on floor one, that they can step in and cover some of those meetings. Now, they're not immediately, and they're probably not the best people to step into committees or to council, but there are a lot of roles that the committee officers do, which are things like members' working groups, things that happen offline, and that will give the sort of capacity and the robustness in the system to cover some of those gaps and eventualities. But again, just to stress, there is still 2 full-time equivalent committee officers or democratic services officers within that structure, as well as the senior business support and democratic services officer, in addition to the business support team who would be able to step in and assist if there's sort of an unprecedented call on demand or a particularly high level of absence.
Thank you, Matthew. Councillor Harris?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Matthew's talked about an ideal world 2 or 3 times. We don't live in an ideal world. We've never lived in an ideal world. And we're up against a scenario where year by year, the amount of money that we receive to run the authority from places on high is reduced, ending up by basically admitting that we're understaffed. There's no other way of putting it. We are understaffed. We can't cover all eventualities. Therefore, we are understaffed. Therefore, we're not fit for purpose. If you can tell me that I'm wrong, I'll be pleased about that. But I'd like to know, and you also mentioned that staffing matters are not a matter for this committee and presumably for any other of the scrutiny committees here. So if we as members have a concern that staff are being overworked, we've got no recourse for them to come to us and pass back to you, seemingly, as select committees. So I'd like to know what you think about that one. Is that the case or not? And as we've got the scrutiny manager here, can you tell us what the status of the Democratic Services Committee is? What's its remit, i.e. is it worth having?
Sorry, are you asking me to answer that one, or did you want Matthew to answer?
Well, I don't mind who answers it, as long as
Okay.
but you're the scrutiny manager.
Democratic Services Select Committees are not scrutiny committees, so I'm not best placed to answer on their role and remit, but I do have an understanding of the legislation around the DSC, and that is that it was set up to make sure that there was support for scrutiny. And I think that was the rationale for taking that report to that committee, was to make sure that scrutiny is resourced, and that has been put forward to you as part of the proposal.
Thank you, Hazel. Matthew, would you like to comment?
Yeah, to come back on that, what I'm talking about there, of course, if members have concerns that staff are placed under undue pressure, it's absolutely right. The role of this committee, the role of members, is to ensure that the arrangements in place provide what you need to operate the democratic, or what we need to operate the democratic function of the committee. The change, if you bring this back to the change, what will be different as a result of these proposals? It means there will be one officer sat in select committee meetings, so no change to council, no change to cabinet, no change to working groups. We would have, if this is put into operation, one member of staff rather than two sat in select committee meetings. Members retain the level of support they have. In fact, it is bolstered. We move from having one scrutiny officer, where I would certainly recognise we have been stretched and under-resourced in recent years. As head of service, that is where I see the primary risk, our lack of capacity in scrutiny. This report looks to remedy that. It takes from one officer to two officers, the number of people working to support select committees. Yes, there is a trade-off with that. Minutes will be shorter and more concise. Looking at what's placed in this call-in, the call-in asks the question of whether that is legal, whether it is appropriate to have more concise meetings. I would say to you, having heard the answer of the Cabinet member, Councillor Jordan, this afternoon, that is appropriate. As an officer, when I sit in meetings, I sit in a lot of meetings and not as many as you, when you think how much time is spent, the energy that goes into producing those minutes, the length of those minutes, where is it as members you want the capacity of your officers to be focused? Is it on engagement with the community? Is it on that scrutiny, the questioning, the in-depth look at the reports brought before you? Or is it in more extensive minutes? Minutes play an important role. But as Councillor Jordan highlighted earlier, when you look back at the last council meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago, I think there were two sets of minutes on the agenda. That discussion took in the remit of 30 seconds to move and pass those minutes. Minutes play an important role. They don't play as important a role in the life of a select committee as the discussions you have beforehand, the work that happens outside the meeting, the questioning strategies you develop. And for me, that is where our limited capacity needs to be focused. Councillor Harris, you made the point. You said, are we fit for purpose because we don't have staff in? Absolutely. You know, a small organisation of incredibly hard-working and committed individuals can achieve a heck of a lot. And I think this council is testament to that. Yes, we don't have the resources that some of our neighbours have. We don't have the resources that the best resourced local authorities have. But what we have, we try to put to the most effective use possible. As I look back at the reasons for the call-in, yeah, I believe those minutes will be fit for purpose. Yes, that does mean the Democratic Services officers doing some work to support select committees but not sitting in them. But just to stress the other elements of those reports, involves an administrative assistant becoming a member support officer. That IT support that was raised and spoken about so much at the last meeting, actually being on tap over this side of the building. The role of the committee officers, what's been taken away, is minute taking in the meeting. There are still other officers within that team that can meet those ICT needs, and they are closer to you. Those members of staff are now over this side of the building. So as your support needs emerge, when you're sat in meetings over this side of the building or in the members' lounge, they're simply next door in terms of those queries. So I go back to the point, overall, this is a net uplift in establishment. It is not a reduction in establishment, and it sees redefined roles for several members of staff to enhance the support that is provided to members. Just to be clear, the role of committee officer is an organisational responsibility, is not a member support role. Member support has been boosted by this structure. Support for scrutiny has been boosted by this structure. What has changed is not having a member of staff sat in those meetings, taking minutes verbatim there and then.
Thank you, Matthew. Are you satisfied with that response, Councillor Harris? Are you happy for me to take Councillor Grocot's questions?
Nobody's ever totally satisfied with any answer, so I'll leave it at that.
Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to ask a question. I'm here as a member of Democratic Services Committee. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. They're both very brief, you'll be pleased to know. The first is, I wonder if Mr. Gatehouse could confirm that in response to his claim that the creation of new opportunities to take the service forward with refreshed purpose and pace was actually countered by the head of Democratic Services, who said that he didn't see the restructure delivering on the reasons outlined in the report, and that he had relayed those concerns to Mr. Gatehouse. My second question, it may be answered by our cabinet member. I suppose it's up to him. I'm absolutely delighted in the context of minutes to hear that less is more. In fact, that was taken to an extreme in a recent meeting of children and young people where there were no minutes. And the reason given was that staff had been too busy to produce minutes in time for a properly constituted and called meeting of this county council. If we are saying that we're setting up an improved service on the one hand, and on the other, meetings properly called and convened don't have any record at all of the previous meeting, then surely we're in a pretty pickle.
Thank you, Councillor Grocott. Can we just note that when you were referring to head of Democratic Services, you actually meant the manager of Democratic Services? Sorry, thank you. Okay, Matt, would you like to comment, please?
I think on that point, there is a lot more we can do to continue to improve the service. John, as service manager, has a service improvement plan. We speak about a lot of those improvements. Members of the committee will have seen, or members of Democratic Services Committee, I should stress, where this matter arose, a note prepared by John after that meeting. And, I think actually 95, 98% of what's in that paper is absolutely the sorts of things we need to be doing. This paper doesn't purport to cover all of the areas we can make to improve the democratic character of the organisation. It mentions some of that, but this is a report around structures. There are a lot more we can do to improve processes and continue to take the service forward. So yeah, absolutely, there is more we can do and more that we can continue to do. Councillor Greco, you mentioned a point, and I know we covered in the last meeting. I see little benefit in revisiting it. There was an occasion when a set of minutes, there was an additional meeting inserted or an additional meeting in the calendar, so it wasn't on the normal 6-weekly cycle, and the minutes weren't available. Yes, apologies, it happened.
Thank you, Matthew. Councillor Watkins.
Thank you. I am the current chair of the Democratic Services Committee, and so thank you for the opportunity to speak. First of all, I'd just like to confirm that the additional report that went forward to the Cabinet member was exactly as we had discussed in the meeting and therefore contained all of the issues. I'm delighted to hear that point 4, which talked about the legality of moving minutes, has been discussed with the monitoring officer, and therefore a shortened minute is actually legal, and that is fine by me. I personally come from the world of business. I am used to dealing with short minutes, which are just decisions, and I don't really like 10 pages of minutes where I can't actually remember the discussion anyway. I'm quite happy to look back on the YouTube. So long as it's legal, I'm very happy that that has now been covered. So that seems fine from my point of view. In terms of the fact that we would go down to one committee officer, one officer serving each select committee, I will still express some degree of concern about that because of the amount of times I'm in a meeting and the ICT fails when I'm in a meeting. So people can't get, we regularly in CYP, for example, have external people coming in to put on slide presentations. They regularly go wrong. We then have to have, it takes quite a lot of attention, and it seems to happen pretty much every CYP committee. So that is the biggest area of issue. I'm prepared to see how it works by having the support outside of the room and then having to be called in, but I still think that is an area where we will struggle in the actual meetings themselves. So that was my primary point for actually raising issues in terms of the Democratic Services meeting when we discussed this particular report. In terms of the human resources aspect and the way the committee handled it, I think it probably would have been a good idea at the beginning of that Democratic Services Committee meeting to highlight the remit of the committee and the fact that we shouldn't actually be discussing an HR function. We should only have been discussing it in terms of the support for members. Because in the same way as I wouldn't expect the planning committee to decide who should be in the planning team downstairs, I also don't think it's actually our job to discuss who should be actually in serving the Democratic Services Committee as well. I think that would have been helpful had that one been re-emphasised to the committee what our actual remit was in looking at that paper. It's always difficult when we know the staff who are actually involved. That's always going to make everything a lot harder to deal with. But that one would have actually been a slight assistance, I think. I think I haven't got any other comments to make. I do think that it would have been useful to have a wider discussion about this so that all members were informed more fully that there would be changes. And I think the greater the availability for councillors to discuss that is the better. So it feels like the timings were a little tight. I understand the reasons for that, but it did seem a bit squashed, and it felt quite important for it actually to get a full hearing amongst a wider audience. But thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watkins. Would any members like to make any more comments? No? Okay, Councillor Eason.
Yeah, I'll come back to my original comment. It's to do with consultation. I don't think consultation seems to have been fully expressed. Councillor Watkins just said basically the same thing. Members should have been a bit more informed. I did ask the question why it didn't go to the Joint Action Group for Trade Unions. There was a meeting cancelled, I think, a while ago, which I can't find a date of. It would have been important if it had gone to that particular meeting, because the trade unions could come and say their perspective on that then. Then the trade unions could come and give their perspective on where they stand. As at this moment, as a member of that committee, I don't know what the trade union side say, unless I go and ask them. And I don't think it's my remit to go and ask them. So I would like to see this not rushed through from the point of view of the points you made on the videos, that your time scales were tight, you need to do this, that and the other before September. I think time may be of the essence in some aspects, but I would like to see a wider consultation, as Councillor Watkins says, through that committee with the members as a whole. It's a pity that members didn't come today to listen to this meeting, so they would have been fully informed. I think that is a failing of members, but somehow we've got to get members to react and interact as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Eason. Matt, would you like to comment, please?
Yeah, just to stress and come back on Councillor Eason's point. The report was shared with GMB and Unison union representatives. I would have been available to take that to JAG had there been a request to do so. I had one sort of clarifying question from the unions on a point of detail, but there was no request to go to JAG and no specific concerns raised with the content of the report from the trade unions.
I find that a bit odd, quite honestly. I think there should be more importance on trying to make sure that issues like that, matters like that, not issues, go to the appropriate committee. I know the GMB represented fully and well, and that person never spoke to me about it. So maybe they didn't have a concern at that level, but as members, I think a more interactive response would have been better.
Sorry, Councillor Traherne.
Thank you, Chair. A lot has been said about the funding that this council receives, or lack of, and that we don't have enough funds to employ more staff. There's a dozen or so members here for this meeting. How much does this meeting cost to lay this on today? And the average cost to hold a meeting in this chamber with low numbers?
Thank you, Councillor Traherne. Matthew, are you happy to answer that one?
I'm not sure I can. I would be hazarding a guess. I think you raise a very good question, Councillor Traherne, in terms of the cost of the meeting, the cost of the call-in. I mean, certainly you look at sort of officer time, officer salaries, travel allowance. Each committee meeting we have carries a financial cost and an opportunity cost in terms of the work that others would be doing with their time. Notwithstanding that, I think the issues of local democracy are sort of incredibly important. And as an officer, I'm always thankful that members sort of give up their time and make the time to come to these meetings. But I think if you cost them up, each meeting is probably running into thousands of pounds. But again, I wouldn't like to put a precise figure on that, because without getting my calculator and slide rule out, it would be a little bit of guesswork.
Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very concerned about the fact that we'll have to think very deeply about something that is of concern to either members of the public or officers or members, that needs to be thought of. We better not do that because it's going to cost us money. That is a bit worrying. We need to do what we need to do.
Councillor Eason.
Just one brief question. With the machinations of jobs and where they go and who people are, which I won't ask for names, has anyone asked about the loss of the part-time post, which might go to the requirement of a full-time post for some you couldn't do a full-time post, for example? Are all the staff that you've consulted happy? Maybe that's the wrong word. Are they happy with the situation if they got to go from a part-time post to a full-time post, for example?
In terms of no sort of particular concerns have been expressed in the consultation process. When it comes to it, a lot of these discussions then follow on from a decision being passed or otherwise. That's when we would sit down with staff, look at the structures, but so no one has come forward with any sort of specific proposals or concerns regarding what that looks like. And of course, one of the things we would always look to do in these situations is use the authority's protection of employment policy. In the event where staff are displaced as a result of structural change, the first priority of myself, the first priority of the organisation is to look at other opportunities within the organisation. We have, if you think, you take out schools, we've got 2,000 posts in the authority. With a reasonable level of turnover, there are job vacancies arising each month. Even as I look sort of within my own sort of relatively small area of the business, policy, governance, customer services, the hubs, we've had a number of vacancies coming up over the last sort of 2 to 3 months while these discussions have been ongoing. Were we in a situation where someone was at risk of redundancy as a result of these proposals, the first thing we would look to do would be to give them prior consideration for any other vacancies in the authority, because the last thing we want to do is wave goodbye to a good member of staff. And the last thing we want to do, just think about it even in pragmatic terms, aside from the risk of losing good people that have a lot to contribute and who we've invested training and development capacity in, is just a practical matter. Why would we want to pay redundancy costs when there are opportunities here that we could redeploy people into? So just to stress, that I can't say it never happens, of course it does, but the first priority of the authority is to seek redeployment opportunities for anyone who would be sort of placed at risk and as a result of this wasn't successful in obtaining one of the roles within the structure.
Thank you, Matthew. I suppose now, if there's no more questions, no one? Good. You now have to indicate which of the 3 options you want to go for. But it's only the select committee members, I am sorry. So are we happy to go to a vote now?
We have 3 options, please.
Number 1, I'll read them out for you. Accept the Cabinet's decision is number 1. 2, refer the matter back to Cabinet for reconsideration. Or 3, refer the matter to Council for consideration. Council's options being to either accept the Cabinet member's decision or refer back to the Cabinet member with reasons. So can you show hands for option 1? Which one?
Option 1 again, please.
Accept the Cabinet member's decision. Number 2, refer the matter back to Cabinet for reconsideration. With reasons, sorry. And number 3, refer the matter to Council for consideration. Council's options being to either accept the Cabinet member's decision or refer it back to the Cabinet member with reasons. 1, 2. Okay. As chair, I have a casting vote, so I'll go with option 1. Sorry.
May I just say that the public will be aware that a member of this committee who wasn't here expressed views that were likely or could likely be different to you as a chair casting having a casting vote.
Thank you, Councillor Harris. I've taken your points on board, but sadly, Councillor Dovey hasn't appeared here today.
Just important that people are there.
That's okay, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for their patience throughout the process and for their attendance, and thank the Cabinet and officers for their input. So the casting vote is to accept the Cabinet member's decision. Thank you.